Well, thank you for that. I would say that that last slide pretty much summarizes a discussion that I had with some of the panelists this morning as to how much can we actually use the F word. And I think that we didn't really get to the other side as much, but let's hope that actually by the end of today we'll be moving away from that precipice and more looking at some of that vision, that boldness, that ambition that we need to show, but also where can we actually go? And I'd like to bring up actually two very important players in that conversation. First, Dennis Pamlin, who's working on mission innovation from a perspective of really bringing innovators together and thinking about what is that future vision, and also that kind of inner child, a little bit what you've just indicated in your opening remarks around let's not stop ourselves from thinking of where we can go. I actually have a very good friend in the Netherlands who happens to be Princess Laurentine, who set up a consultancy with children. And this is exactly what she's doing. These school children are actually consulting big business, and the exchange is the following. The children are brought forward some really key issues that the big companies have, but the boards of those companies have been told that if you don't actually respond or listen to what those children say, there's no deal. So you can't just go away and say, oh yeah, that was really cute, but we're not going to do anything about it. You actually have to come and interact. And it has been phenomenal in terms of opening up the minds of some of these corporates. So it's exactly as you indicated. We have a tendency to shut off that part of our brain, that inner child where we think everything is still possible. That dreamer that Molly actually was talking about, the fact that we can turn the dream into a vision or not into a nightmare and a night sweat, which tends to be what we tend to do for the moment. So I'm going to ask both Dennis and Andrew to come up because I think they're going to bring very different perspectives of that inner child, that exploration, how can we actually move this game forward? How can we go beyond the borders? Some of the conversation that we had yesterday was quite technical around the financial taxonomy and some of the frameworks that we can put in place, the enabling, or we're not allowed to say enabling anymore because Mariana told us we couldn't use enabling or facilitating, but the policy. Now we're going to get into what's the vision? How can we actually get there? And what's the urgency as well, as I had indicated yesterday. So I'm going to ask Dennis to come up first. And also just say, Dennis, that it's been such a pleasure working with you through the Climate-KIC Advisory Council and the way in which we've bounced off ideas. This is a great ideas man, but also an ideas man that tries to bring these ideas to fruition. So, Dennis.
Thank you very much, and fantastic to be here. And I love the name of this session, Investing in the Tomorrow We Want Today, because I think it's this tension that we tend to forget. We talk about these brilliant things and the need for transformations, the need for disruptions, and then we go back till today and we separate these two things. How do we start linking what we do today to what we actually want to achieve tomorrow? So that's not my presentation. How does this work? Or do I just close to the... No?
Maybe the back room can put on the presentation?
So, yeah. Well, let's start without the presentation, and I hope that the people...
Is it on?
You'll tell me when it's on. Because I wanted just to start by saying that one of the challenges, I think, is that we treat climate change... yeah, that's not mine.
No. Cameron, do you want to come up and actually start your presentation now?
So, I love technology will solve everything, won't it? That's us, that's me, that's now. So the first thing is that climate change tends to be framed as an environmental health issue on the side. That's how we used to frame that. But climate change is something different. It's one of 12 things that can end human civilization. And I think that's not the best thing to communicate to everyone everywhere, but sometimes we need to reconnect and realize that this is not something where we have many options. This is an existential threat to us. This is a new thing. We've not really had that. The dinosaur had the the asteroids, etc. We are creating our own challenges. And that's a very new thing for us, and we don't frame it like that. We tend to look at that as a risk issue on the side, etc. This is something fundamentally different. And that sort of comes back also that climate change is often this group together with other environmental issues and part of ESG, something that someone on the side within companies and organizations are dealing with. The weakest department, the weakest part of the company who comes in at the last part and reports due to communication issues, not based on strategy. And I think this sort of honesty about where we actually are with climate change is important to bring forward, because it's not being dealt with in that way. In small groups of people, like us maybe, we might do that, but most people don't. And I would argue 99% of society do not frame climate change as an existential threat, as a driver where we need to go. So it's this old idea, you know, environment is just bringing us back, and all people working with innovation, etc., they bring society forward, and then there are the people screaming about climate and environment, trying to stop things. And that's sort of the idea of this being something that is stopping, not creating something that Sandrine was talking about. How do we reframe that? And the third thing that I just want to touch on, and this might be the most difficult and problematic one, is that the need for reduced emissions is often based on assumption that the current system is the one we should have. And we talk about how do we reduce emissions? How do we set scientific-based reduction target in the existing system? That might not be totally wrong, but often it doesn't help us to create the tomorrow we want when the world is looking very different. When it's not about incrementally improving the current trajectories, but where things are merging very fast. How much time should you work on making a fossil fuel engine slightly more smart? And how much should you spend on making cities so you can walk in them? Or having teleworking being present? Or having sharing as a concept that you allow people to think differently on how they move themselves. So all these things becomes a lot more interesting, but it's also about what future do we want to create. All of a sudden we reframe the idea, not about stopping and who are the big polluters, to how do we create nutrition? How do we provide mobility? How do we provide building spaces in a way that is in harmony with nature? So that, I would argue that this might be one of the most important images that we tend to forget, is that we all improve. It's all getting a little bit better. We all, if we only do a little bit better, then things are moving in the right direction. And we tend to forget to take a step back, that the problems are growing exponentially. Now, only looking at the population growth, you know, we're going to be basically 50% more people. So anything that is not a 50% improvement is actually relatively moving us backwards. So, and we usually talk about 10%, 20% improvement. That's sort of been our mindset. We've been on the incremental side, not thinking about the kind of future. How do we live in on a beautiful society with 11 billion people on one planet? What's the vision for that beautiful society? Rather than saying, these are the big polluters, how do we get rid of those? Because that will not get us to a positive vision of where we actually want to go. And why is this now such a fantastic place to live? So these are not maybe the most, not the things that make you smile in the morning. You might consider those to be a bit of a challenge. But we now have a situation where all major stakeholders realize that incremental improvements is not enough. This is not driven by climate change, it's driven by value shift, it's driven by technology explosions, etc. But even the last people, the people at World Economic Forum and other places that are the last to see new things, they are the ones who now realize also that we are in this fourth industrial revolution, where everything will change. Where we don't have car companies saying, oh, we have a 20 years time horizon, we can't really change, saying next year, we don't know. Bill Ford comes out and says, I don't know who my competitors are. Is it Uber? Is it Apple? Is it Microsoft? Who is actually providing mobility, physical and virtual, in the future? The automotive industry is a dying concept, just providing something that people use 2% of the time on 4 wheels. What is that? That's sort of a small package in a mobility system. So that's very exciting. People are open to disruption now. That was not the case 10, 20 years ago. And I have this, don't read the details, but I use this as a sort of guiding tool that many of our things that we created, I've been part of that, sort of the reporting systems, the labeling system, they were done in a world that was dominated by fossil fuel companies. I don't know, how many of you were in Kyoto? Well, maybe not that many, but you might remember the Global Climate Coalition, the people who are fighting things, and we have basically 70% of the biggest companies in the US were fossil fuel based. Now that's not the case anymore. You have solution providers, and even the polluters, the two ones that are still on the top list, are now acknowledging climate change. But we are still asking as if it's the big polluters who should take small steps. We're not looking at how we create this new world. We have not been really much part of creating this shift. We've been creating a little bit more of transparency, but we've not really been part of this exciting new future. And I think that's where we need to go. Because we've seen this technology happening so quickly now. Over the last 8 years only, we've seen LED lights move down 90%, PV falling with 50%. All of a sudden, things that people said was impossible is now possible. So it's a totally different world. And it's not just about these technologies. It's also about drones. It's about DNA sequencing, etc. There are falling prices on magnitudes over the last years. So it's just opening up totally new opportunities. And we are still thinking incremental. But also that new transparency and tools are available. Yesterday we talked about the old kind of reporting. Most people today know that's just days away from being obsolete. With big data, with AI allowing us to collect and process data in new ways, and also getting real data from sensors out there, rather than self-reported guesses in old spreadsheets. Well, they might play a role, but the days are numbered. And how much are we investing in tomorrow? How much are we stuck in the old ways? But maybe most important of all is the Overton Window's rapid move. The Overton Window is where, the famous saying that first they call you crazy, then they obstruct you, and then finally they embrace you. The Overton Window is sort of the scientific part of that. How does ideas go from unaccepted and crazy to mainstream? This is happening much faster than ever before. Unfortunately, during the last few years, the Overton Window might have moved in a direction that we might not find the most exciting. But if we see how fast that has happened, that should also give us room for encouragement and thinking about things in a more optimistic way. How can we reframe things equally fast in the other direction or another direction? And also realize that we are so stuck in our thinking. 1975, 40 years ago, where we're looking 40 years in the future, in this sort of low carbon, beautiful future, that was the digital camera back then. And 20 years ago, that was the smartest mobile phone. I don't know how many of you were carrying those around, feeling really cool and high tech. Things are moving so fast, but we don't have that imagination. When we invest in today, how much are we thinking about those kind of transitions in the next 20 years? Are we open to that? Like Sandrine said, children are more thinking about how can we do all these things. We tend to limit ourselves and be rational, but rational being stupid. That means short-sighted, just looking backwards, not looking ahead. And that's where I think it's interesting that the Mission Innovation that I'm part of, and also RISE, the organization that I'm representing, was created begin 2017. Mission Innovation was created in Paris 3 years ago. We see now new entities trying to bring out new ideas and see how they can collaborate with CDP, Carbon Delta, and other sort of stakeholders at the forefront and say, how can we reform those organizations so they're still relevant? Because 20 years now, it's like saying 100 years ago organizations today. So how do we bring things? And, fantastic, IPCC P1. We should celebrate this. For the first time, we have a scenario that is a little bit smart. IPCC used to produce these things. People say, we need carbon capture. We need negative emissions. Why? Because we used models, and the IPCC used stupid models that was used on the supply side. Well, because it's easy and simple, and no one asked for that. Now for the 1.5, when we say, if it's really you're going to do something, then we said, of course, we can also be smart. We can use things in a smarter way. We can eat differently. We can move differently. And then all of a sudden we show that we don't even need negative emissions to reach 1.5 if we want, if we move away from thinking old to thinking new. And that is absolutely amazing. So please, wherever you go, talk about P1 LED, the low energy demand scenario. That's about being smart. That is about starting to embrace. And they're not very ambitious in that, but it's the first time we really have on the global scale a reference point to being smart and not just doing what we've done before. So I think we should not underestimate the historical importance of that we have that now. And that's what we are building on Mission Innovation and this avoided framework, is trying to see how can we start seeing what are the solutions that helps us get to that 1.5 world. Of course, we should still invest in negative emissions and CCS and all these things as a backup, but those things might not work. So we should bet on being smart first, and then we have as an insurance, if we're not smart enough, we try to be more stupid, or using old technologies and sort of trying to save the old system a bit more. So what we've done is super simple. It's just saying, if you put something out here, how is that compared? How do we start allowing people to compare video conferencing to flying, to e-books, to dead forest books? How do we get these transitions of doing things smarter? How do we make sure that we may move away from technology as the only innovation to also lifestyle changes? Allowing people to walk or bike is as innovative as the most sophisticated electric vehicle. How do we bring in those kind of changes into the innovation system? Because we're still very linear, still very technology-driven, not system-driven, not sort of broader innovation-driven. And it's really about reframing this. So the idea of this framework is to go through 3 steps depending on where you are. Reframe. How do you not only look at the problems and reduce emissions, how do you also look at the solution part of that? And how do you reprioritize? Because both are needed. It's not that the only thing is bad. I want to emphasize that. It's not that it's bad to ask for disclosure for the big polluters. It's just that if that is the only thing we do, we will only find incremental improvements. If we start looking also on the solution side, we can see real shifts in society. And then how do we bring together the finance sector, the solution providers, and those who are going to buy these things? Public procurement, big companies, cities, etc., together and create this rapid transition that is needed. And just and end by sort of emphasizing a little bit on the different steps then. So one of the things here is to move from how companies do things to what they do. The ESG to green revenues. This is just an example from FTSE Russell, which I think is super interesting. It's also a bit of messy, their own graphs, but what they look is the new economy growing. Who are part of making money in that? And then ESG is a little bit on how do we deal with the old world? How do we try to manage their bad behavior? But it's more important for us as we move forward to really understand who are the ones, who are the winners in tomorrow's economy, who are the ones providing what we actually need, and who's trying to manage their own operation in the best way. And the thing, sorry? Yeah, and the last thing, the thing that I thought going to sort of totally change society was when the EAI, the International Energy Agency, came out in 2011 and said, if we don't do anything radical before 2017, last year, we have locked us into more than 2 degrees. Not talking about 1 degree. So when we talk about a smooth transition, that will not happen. We have already built a system that will emit more than we can do. So we need to look at radical changes. We need to make sure that those are just, but it's not going to be a smooth journey from here on. If we think that, we're fooling ourselves because we already built ourselves into a system that is not the one we can have. So I think that's super important, and they were very clear on that. But there wasn't a discussion in 2017 that we actually didn't do that and that we now start to look at more radical changes. And the final thing is, how do we then move from incremental improvements to system transformations? How do we move away from making cars slightly more better to how do we provide smart mobility, both physical and virtual? How do we move away from making meat a little bit better to how do we provide protein, etc.? How do we look at what we provide? And that's where the exciting things comes in, because that's where we focus on what do society need, not how have we done things before. And that's where I'm going to end. So now, today, we're launching this countdown. We're going to start collecting those solutions that are part of this 1.5 journey, and I hope many of you have those. But even more important, I would argue, is that we're going to have solution framework innovators. Who are those that are starting to reframe their work in order to bring those solutions that are needed, not just reduce that? So you can nominate solutions on this webpage, you can become a framework explorer, and you can help develop this framework. This is not something that's set in stone. We're going to develop this jointly. We don't believe in small clubs doing things together. We believe in the Wikipedia approach of things. So that's where I'm going to end. Mission Innovation Solution Framework, it's yours for you to use, and thanks for taking a bit more than that, but I got so excited about Sandrine. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis, for setting the tone so well of what this day needs to be around the reframing and also opening our minds up to what those possible solutions are. And I'd like to now bring up Andrew Parry, because I actually think that, Andrew, you're doing some of this thinking in a very different environment, and it's not easy. But I hope that you have some enlightening and very open news about how you're shifting the bar within the investment community, because I know Hermes is really playing quite a leadership role. Thank you.
I sort of learned long ago that if you go second, don't bother with charts, because the person beforehand will actually probably almost certainly have better charts. I learned that from following Al Gore earlier this year, which was a tough act to follow. Dennis is an equally tough act to follow as well. And there were lots of things that resonated with me in Dennis's talk. But what was really interesting, when Dennis was talking, he wasn't actually really talking a lot about my industry. And it's really refreshing for me to stand in front of an audience where I don't recognize many people and to listen to conversations about science and innovation, entrepreneurship, academic research, rather than people trying to wrap up a product and sell it to me, because that's what I do. And I think this is quite an important thing when we come to frame the role of finance. I think sometimes it's very easy to think finance through its products and services is the actual solution, when it's only a small part of the actual whole complex problem that we're dealing with. And really that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the transitions that we're seeing within our industry, some of the challenges, I think, in delivering real systemic change, because that's what we need. You know, as the IPC said, we need transformational, unprecedented transformational change. And that change is not just around climate, because climate connects so much of society and the planet. I'd often refer to it as the four riders of the apocalypse. You know, climate change, geopolitics, demographics, and technology. They're all complex, they're all non-linear, they're all interconnected, and they all are creating an incredible uncertainty, both for individuals worrying about their future, about their jobs, but also companies worrying about their business models. Dennis just talked about the disruption that is being wrought on many business models. I'm not just head of sustainability at Hermes Investment Management, I'm also co-chair of the UNEP FI Positive Impact Initiative, where we're trying to rethink impact. We're trying to rethink impact as really trying to encourage the creation of business-enabled business models, impact-enabled business models. So rather thinking of it in that linear, normal, hierarchical way of solving problems, actually reversing it and trying to think putting impact, managing both the negatives and the positive at the heart of business models. Undoubtedly, we need leadership, and very strong leadership. It's great that the investment management industry is stepping up to the plate. I think we recognize as an industry that sustainability is no longer an option, it's an imperative. But for many people trying to come into this space, it's riddled with acronyms, synonyms, competing frameworks, and there's a lot of confusion about what good looks like. I think sometimes that quest for distilling everything down to a number, a rating, or a ranking sometimes impedes our ability to move forward. The world isn't so simple that we can find the answers 42, as in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It is messy, it is complicated, it is disruptive, and that is quite challenging for people who typically look at indices as their base level, their baseline for what's good. We have to do better than an index. But as an index might contain a lot of companies that frankly are going to die or find that their business models become stranded in the next decade, is that a good way of thinking about it? Should we think about sustainability as a normalized relative concept? No, we should think about it as a set of absolutes that we need to address. But in our world, that's quite difficult to do because we have performance bogeys. One of the things that I very much believe that we need to do is go beyond disclosure. Again, Dennis and I talked about this and he discussed it. At the moment, a lot of the investment industry focuses on ESG. Everybody in Europe now integrates ESG, or certainly they claim to. Even in America, I was there 2 weeks ago doing an extensive tour. Everybody wanted to hear about how do you integrate ESG. And my answer to them was don't. Don't use ESG. That's so 1990s. It's so prescriptive. It's so backward-looking. You need to really start to think about the sustainability of your investee companies, the sustainability of your portfolios. It's a much more dynamic, much more forward-looking approach that encompasses more than risk. But also, it puts a pressure on you to move from disclosure, often unaudited, inconsistent, not standardized information that's elective, and more to discovery. And I think some of the most exciting things about data now are not in the more traditional forms of ESG, but in these new unstructured and structured data sets that are out there. Many leading asset managers, Hermes included, are beginning to look into these areas because they begin to allow you to, one, regionalize impacts. There's no point looking at water as a global concept. It's a highly regionalized problem. Look outside, there's not a water shortage in Dublin today. And begin to actually put in context much better some of the issues and challenges that we're trying to tackle, not just from a risk perspective, but it then actually helps you with reversing it out to tackle it from the demand side. I think also that disclosure, a discovery approach helps give us a better voice, because one of the voice that we do have as investors, and that doesn't matter whether we're active or passive, equities or credit, public or private, is our ability to engage in a conversation with the companies. After all, it's not us as asset owners, or if you're an investment manager, a representative of the people, the beneficiaries who ultimately own the assets. It's actually the companies that have to do this. Sometimes I listen to the rhetoric from my industry, and it sounds like we're doing all the hard work. It's actually not. We have to subcontract this through our engagement to companies. Companies, the people who make things, burn things, consume things, sell things, innovate. They're the people who are at the front line. They employ people. So very much it's trying to get people, when they're thinking about sustainability, to think about less about a portfolio, but thinking about the components of the portfolio, beginning to think much more about what the companies do and why, rather than just some aggregate risks. Here, corporate engagement is really important, and it's great to see that has been transformative in the last few years. Not that long ago, many of the biggest asset owners in the world who were passive didn't vote, they didn't engage. We're beginning to see a transformation in that. They're beginning to recognize you cannot afford to be an absentee landlord. You cannot afford to not take responsibility and use your voice and your vote and your voice. So that's really good to see. I think we're also beginning to see a reframing of some of the language for some of the more forward-thinking investors. As I said, ESG tends to be focused on process and risk, but we need to take that forward and look at the forward-looking information, which is actually really where the value in a company is going to come from. is actually what it's going to do in the future, particularly these emerging growth companies, particularly in those companies that are innovating and transforming their business models. It's the future value that they create, not the past activities that they undertake, are the most important. So in terms of actually looking how we engage on that, we're beginning to find this language of sustainability, of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, is beginning to be a great way of reframing how we think about that engagement with companies. It's about setting conversations around outcomes rather than inputs. Very much thinking about what corporate purpose is about. What are the companies actually trying to achieve? Really trying to drill under the surface of what the materiality, a word that's bandied around a lot. But in a world of normalized ESG scores, you have no concept of materiality because normalization takes away the absolute. So it begins to help us frame both the conversation in understanding how integrated sustainability is into their business models. When you ask the CEO who the head of sustainability is, and they turn to the IR person and said, who is it? They're not really doing it properly. When you actually talk to the head of sustainability and ask who they report to, and they say to head of HR, really sustainability in that company is only a function of CSR. We're needing to really transform the way that people think, and we have to transform the way that we actually interact with companies to ask questions around strategy and purpose, materiality in the future, rather than report the last quarter's numbers. And that's still a very hard thing for us to resist. Our industry is built around that, the way that we measure ourselves against indices. Remember, indices are yesterday's growth story you buy today. Really, active management, which is what I'd like to think I represent, is about buying tomorrow's growth stories today.
Okay, Andrew, you've got one more minute.
Okay. So, I think really I'm very aligned with Dennis. I really do think that we need to really reframe the question about how we interact with companies. I'm not quite sure that we need to sort of go as far to constantly push for new business models, but to really get them to be adaptive and to recognize that many of the models that they're working with are going to be stranded. Already the oil and gas industry seems to be changing, at least on the surface, but it only goes so far. And this is where sometimes the problem of disclosure crops up. That you look at the number of resolutions that have been successfully passed to integrate carbon disclosures. But still, the vast majority of companies are investing assets and accelerating their asset accumulation at a pace that is commensurate with 4 degrees of warming. So their rhetoric and their actions don't always match. So again, holding them accountable through both legal process and through corporate engagement is going to be an imperative. And I want to take one more minute just to say one quick thing that is a fear of mine and why everybody collectively having a voice is so important. My biggest fear about a lot of the great things that we're doing, particularly in Europe, is around something I call the sustainability arbitrage. The danger is that other parts of the world might very much view this with a shorter-term lens, with the Milton Friedman view that maximization of profits over the short term is the only form of social responsibility. As America, sometimes at the federal level, seems to be going in the opposite direction to Europe, as the direction in Africa and Asia is still uncertain, we have to make sure that we carry the voice of the world if we're going to actually change the system, rather than trying to do it all in isolation. I'll just leave on one final quote. A quote I've come to like as I was on holiday in Boston recently. And it was from Kennedy's inauguration address. And it links back to Nick Robbins and the just transition. And I think it's something we should always ponder in a world of growing inequality of wealth. And his quote, part of his quote was, "If a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few that are rich. This is not just about social and environmental justice. It's about maintaining a world that can actually support our business models, support our pensions. So sustainability definitely is an imperative. Thank you.
Andrew, for completing, actually you've done a nice circle, considering that I opened up with a variety of different references to both JFK and Robert Kennedy's speeches. And I couldn't agree with you more in terms of ensuring that we bring more people on board, and that's kind of what I want to focus on now. Dennis, the work that you're doing is opening up the minds of many to think about those different solutions, and mission innovation is part of that. I guess I have a question for you, and then I'm going to turn to you, Andrew. How much of this is around creating a sense of belonging and building a sense of trust so that you don't actually isolate people and you bring more people on board? And how much of it is around a moonshot type of approach? And coming back to Kennedy, what was interesting was that actually the whole moonshot approach of bringing a man to the moon was developed around a narrative of bringing people on board, getting people involved, because he knew very well it was going to be expensive, and therefore he had to develop a sense of being part of this incredible exploratory new wave of moving forward and technology, etc. So how can we do that and move quickly? Because then I'm going to bring one more issue, which is the 1.5, and what the IPCC clearly said is the difference between 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees is not the technology, it's the pace. Yeah. And so the pace is essential. And Christiana Figueres always says, I feel like I've swallowed an alarm clock. And I think all of us who feel that we've swallowed an alarm clock is that we're constantly being woken up every single day by that alarm clock, indicating that we don't have a hell of a lot of time. So I'm going to open that up in terms of that kind of juxtaposition, taking into consideration also what we're seeing in terms of the US, the populism, the backlash, this isolationism, which is making it really difficult for us to collectively come together. And I'm going to close with one more thing. I don't know if you were in Paris. I was both in Kyoto and in Paris. And if you were in that final plenary room, I think that maybe we can share, because for me, it was an out-of-body experience. It was a fundamental sense that people had come together in Paris for a variety of different reasons and decided, okay, we're going to do that. And I was recently with Nick Stern and several others that had been in that room, and we said, where the hell did we go wrong? This was 2 days ago. And we were thinking, 3 years from then, and the atmosphere is totally different. We're not talking about collective solutions. We're talking about fear. We're talking about migration. We're talking about refugees. We're talking about wars. We're not talking about collectively working together around one particular goal. So tell us you can solve all of this.
Yeah, that's, I don't know which question to start to answer, but I think what we try to do now is basically working on 2 levels. One is more on the conceptual level to focus on where we actually need to go, not so the incremental steps that we take, but really refocus on 1.5 and how quickly we need to go there, but focus on the opportunity sides to that. But the other thing is also to be very much specific and say, so it's interesting to have that general discussion, but when you bring that down to what we call Monday morning tasks, so this is very inspirational, but you go back, what's different then? So how do we start getting specific tools and guidance that makes tomorrow's decisions, tomorrow's investments different from today? Because that's also the theme of this, investing in tomorrow we want, today. And that's where this framework is around. So how do we start taking the first step? Asking, Andrew was talking about in terms of starting to not just asking for disclosure, but also discovery. What's the first step you do on that journey? So that's the kind of framework we want to do, and these sort of 3 steps. But I think beyond everything, it's bringing more people to this. It's been a small community of committed people, and they talk to each other. And we talked about yesterday, green bonds is exciting, and we have a whole conference about that, and it's still, not even making a blip on the screen for most investors. So how do we mainstream the radical change that is needed? So it's not a small group on the side discussing these things, but it becomes a mainstream issue. So we must be much bolder to go out and discuss with people who's not been part of this discussion before.
So how do you do that? I'm going to put you on the spot. Right now, we've got half the population in the United States that is turning towards a Trump don't believe in climate. How do you shift that? Do you use the Cambridge Analytica psychological profiling type of way, which is you start to manipulate data because that's the only way you can, so you actually do psychological profiling for good? How do you get the mass movement?
I think that the important thing is to not think there's one silver bullet. That's sort of the one mistake we do. It's about saying that you can be a lawyer thinking about how you reframe things. You can be an economist thinking about new models. You can be a technology provider doing this. You can be policymakers. So we need to bring sure and make sure that what we focus is the broader system change that is needed and the basic services that are needed. How do we provide nutrition? How do we provide mobility? How do we provide living for people in a just and a sustainable way? And then how we do that, let a lot of ideas flourish. Because the idea is if we just have one idea, and that's where the danger has been with offsetting and CCS, etc., sort of bring a few silver bullets, and then people say, oh, so we don't need to do anything radical. No, and also one thing that I think we should all have, we should have at least 5 scenarios that are possible, just to take us forward. We can't just bet on one thing moving ahead. And I think that's one of the major dangers has been we're fighting between solar and wind and all these things and say, no, we need to be able to make as much solar. No, yeah, but not only that. We need to make have a strategy for solar that if wind is not happening. So how do we have multiple solutions that can get us to 1.5 degrees? So we not just be radical in terms of reaching 1.5, we need to be radical enough to think about how we do that in multiple ways if other parts of the system fails. And I think that's sort of bring the whole thing into an emergency also. I think a lot of people have said that. Well, that's we shouldn't be that as an environmental issue. It should be on the front page, it should be on the legal pages, it should be on the economic pages, etc. And that's one of the biggest challenges for us, to sort of move out the ESG and sustainability box to the mainstream box. This is a societal challenge.
So that's a perfect inroad to your actual title, Andrew. Because your title is, you're still head of sustainability. And actually, as you were saying, and some of you are linked to the HR function. Actually, we shouldn't have a head of sustainability officer. Sorry, it's not that I want to obliterate your role, but we should actually have it fully integrated into the entire company, and it should be a systems approach, as you were indicating. So how do you actually fundamentally do that? Because you're still one of those voices a little bit sidelined.
Well, it's a hell of a lot better being head of sustainability than head of ESG.
Yeah,
that's definitely true.
That is true. But tell us what the real difference is then.
The real difference, as I see it, but Mark Campanelli made a sort of, I think it's his quote, a lot of people are claiming it. He said, ESG is what keeps me up at night, impact is what gets me up in the morning. And you can put sustainability. I think the reason I like talking about sustainability is that we all want sustainable business models. We all want sustainable financial returns in our pension funds and savings. The only way we can have a sustainable financial return is to have sustainable social and environmental licenses to operate. And the whole idea is to try and link that into it. This is just finance 101. And so what we have tried to do at Hermes is not launch ESG products. We want all our products just to do it because it's a natural part of that basic financial input.
So you actually, all of your products already have gone through some screening criteria to make sure that you're actually predominantly investing in green products.
Yeah, and we, like everybody, we started with the screening. The way that we've been evolving it, and I think the way that a lot of the industry is beginning to evolve it, is beginning to move forward to the demand, is we really need to shift the demand profile. When people talk about decarbonizing their portfolios, it's very easy to take out the biggest carbon emitters in your portfolio and end up with an 80% reduction in carbon versus the benchmark with relatively limited tracking error. You actually haven't decarbonized the world. You've sent a weak signal to the sector that's already pretty well capitalized. What you have to do to decarbonize is actually then think about all the other companies who are indirect or direct clients of oil and gas and utilities. Think about how we all actually live our lives. We all feel quite comfortable having all plastic bottles and shampoo bottles and things like that in our bathroom and say, oh, we recycle and that's great. but they all come from a cracker plant next to an oil refinery in the first place.
Yeah.
So we're not framing the discussion enough around the products and services and the demand. And for me, that's how I've been trying to shift our thinking, is that I don't want to exclude anything. I just don't want to own them because they're all bad business models and unattractive investments. And so it's really trying to reframe that question from not from what you exclude, but from why you buy something, about the excitement about these emerging growth opportunities. They are tomorrow's future if we get it right. But, I do a lot of talks where I have to talk to pension funds all around the world. It's slightly easier when you talk about sustainability in Europe. It's a lot harder in Asia and the States. But it's not always easy in Europe. There's a lot of white male and stale people like me on trustee boards of pension funds who go, oh, we remember SRI, we can't put social or environmental considerations before performance. And they're quite right, because they have quite onerous
And even
obligations.
now, you haven't seen a shift? I mean, I'm just
No,
wondering, there's a big wake-up call with the 1.5 report, and I think recent reports where we're starting to see that boards are shifting.
Well, the point I was going to make is when you have those conversations about sustainability, if you frame it in the fear, if you frame it in the one, in climate change is a systemic risk, is going to change life on the planet if we don't do something about it very soon. They sort of shut down. I know, I do that at home, and my wife tells me to shut up about it. She's a liberal. She's not. So, I have to, when I'm talking to these people, go and frame it around how can we actually make money through capitalizing on these transitions in the system.
Yeah.
And if you do that, then they buy into it. And you have to make it, as well, context-based. If you come up with a prescriptive plan that's around fear, forget it. Nobody's going to implement it. They have to see, because they're trying to balance fiduciary duty. They've got other types of regulators on their back. We're told sustainability is great in Europe. It's not so great in America. It gets very confusing. But if you actually put it down to the individual businesses and opportunities and say, this is an exciting way to invest, this is a better way to manage your risks, this is a better way to disclose and report to your members, they find that a lot easier. Cognitive psychology tells you that fear of climate change has been used too much and will never work.
Yeah. So I think all of those of us who've been involved in this for a long time have realized very much that it hasn't worked. I would like to just open it up for a burning question, or a couple burning questions, and not comments, please, burning questions. Yes, and please introduce yourself. And then there's one here from Cameron. Can we have a microphone, please? I don't know who has the mics. Great, thank you. So this right here.
Hi, my name is Etienne Cadestin. I work for a company called Longevity Partners. Andrew, you mentioned pension funds. I work in the property industry, and we know that core property investments at the moment are around, they're happy with 2.5%, 3% return, massive yield compression. We also know that they're paying their pensioners about 5-6%. I mean, where's the gap coming from, and do you think that could be the risk for the next financial crisis?
Okay, and I'm going to take a question here from Cameron.
Thanks. Sandrine, I loved your question to Dennis about what to do with the Trump voters. You didn't put it in those terms, but I'd like you to ask it again. And I'd like a serious engagement with it, because unless the right of the political spectrum can be brought along here, I don't think we get anywhere.
Okay, I'll take one quick question over here. And then I'm going to make a demand. Oh, I've got one over here. Okay, well, Gina, you're the one holding the microphone. If you can tell me I can take another question, then I'll take another question. Yes, please.
Yes, my name is Pierre Rousseau. I'm a senior advisor for a sustainable business in BNP Paribas. I have one question for Dennis mainly. First, good presentation, and thank you for that. I would like to see all the solution is also coming from bringing together corporates and investors. And today, everything has been done in the financial industry in order to have silos between corporates and investors. Do you have some vision about that? And if you can give some ideas, or we can improve that, because I do believe this is a key point.
Yeah, very good question. Yes?
Peter Cripps from Environmental Finance. A question for Andrew. You make this compelling case about looking for the future, sustainable investments, and yet it's not happening. Pension funds just aren't buying it. They're tracking indexes. It's all market capitalization weighted. So if you had a magic wand, what would be the one thing that you would ask for to change the game? Would it be a redefinition of fiduciary duty, for example? Would it be, I don't know, what would you, if you could ask for one big swinging fist, what would you ask for?
Great questions. Gentlemen, who wants to start first?
I start with the first question because I can link the first to the last.
Okay, go for it.
If that's okay. So your point about pensions and their funding challenges is very well made. Blame it on QE. You know, it's a mathematical linkage as you drove down interest rates, stripped assets of their returns, so it's become very hard for pension funds to make their 4% over inflation. So we do have a structural challenge. I think it's a very important structural challenge in the DB scheme because it plays to Peter's question, why aren't pension funds doing more? Because so many of them are underfunded, so many of them are under stress. The easiest answer is not to reframe fiduciary purpose, is to reframe actually how we value pension funds. It's unfortunately the actuarial linkage to interest rates impedes them from allocating capital because of their funding regimes. And that's the biggest problem I have when I talk to pension funds, is not feeling they can't think about environmental, social, is they have return criteria they have to make as a minimum, and so that is limiting some of their thinking.
So Dennis, I'm going to turn to you, but what I think is really interesting in this reaction is exactly what you were saying at the beginning of your speech, which is we're constrained with the structures that we have in place, and it doesn't enable us to think outside of them. And this is one of the biggest issues.
Yeah, I'm going to link the two questions that I think are, for me, burning the most in terms of how do we create the clusters that need to move forward, and also how do we make sure that it's not sort of an elite discussion among a few. And I think this is one of the biggest failures of the whole sustainability movement that we're looking at right now with the Brexit, the Orbans and the Trump, etc. That we've been talking on behalf of future generations, the poor, etc., and how much better the world will be for them. But they don't trust us. They turn to people who are talking about exact the opposite. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we face now in terms of how do we reframe our conversation about being more inclusive and making sure that we have voices of those who feel sort of, when you talk about bitcoins and disruption, etc., they see job losses. They see not being relevant in society anymore. I think there's sort of this great discussion about after the Second World War, we had people on images all around the world seeing how they helped rebuild society. You had humans in society being as their sort of heroes. Now we have algorithms and everything. People are talking about TED Talks. But the ordinary person do not feel connected to that. They don't feel their role in society. And I think, how do we re-own that? How do we provide this and show with concrete examples and be out there talking with the real people about how that is generated? And that's also come back to my more sort of my day-to-day work in how do we break up the silos? How do we make sure that the framework is actually built around the idea that we need to make sure that to provide mobility, we need people from the automotive sector, we need the digital sector, we need the construction sector to come together to find these new generation of solutions. And we need the different part of the financial system. Because we talk about sometimes the financial sector as isolated and sometimes individual parts of the financial sector. But for this to be transformative, we need to think beyond that. We need to reboot and say, what's the role of the financial system? What's the role of actuaries? What's the role of rating institutions? What's the role of VC companies? And see how those fit together. And that's one of the key parts as we move forward now in this collaboration is see how do we create that tomorrow's finance map? The map from reaction and old structures to how do we look at the whole system solution. So that's really, I'd love to continue this conversation about how we actually break that up, because I think that's the most important question of moving away from these individual improvements to system solutions. And then on the political side, it's more, how do we really reboot this in order to make something that you have people excited about this future? And that's where we need to, I think, balance, because I think we have something, I don't think we should be afraid of saying that there is a big threat out there. Churchill managed to do that. He pointed out the big threat, but he also said, I ask for you to do something. And what we have forgot to ask is not just talk about algorithms and cool new solutions. What's your role in that? Yeah. What do you do? And not just shift a light bulb. That's not my survival. That's a sort of a side thing. And I think that's been one of our biggest mistakes. We've sort of done this sort of guilt thing on the hobby things. What's your role as a working person, as your contribution as a teacher, as a lawyer or something? You're all part of this. And I think that's really something we need to emphasize over the coming years, that everyone has a part of this transition. All hands on deck. We can't, and it's not just about we want to be nice to people. We need that. We need all the innovation we can get, because it's not just about a few people that do the TED Talks. And I think that's one of the problems with the IT society, is that we all tend to look at a few people who are, good with words and have some nice slides. But we all need the people that do the actual work on the ground, because many of the people who talk are not the good action people. And that sort of that disconnect needs to be connected. Sorry, that was too long, but it's so important.
I'm going to build on that as well as we move into our next session, if you allow me. But I think Andrew wants to say a couple of words, then we have to close this.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly. So I've been pondering on sort of both of those questions, and they are, as Dennis has said, linked. I very much see companies being forced by the political polarization to recognize that there's a vacuum in the center. There's a vacuum probably around labor transition, around technology, around climate and environment, and many other areas that they know is not going to be solved by either the left or the right. And it's not just a right issue. It can sometimes be the left. And when doing some research into this, I think companies, and there is a growing movement of recognizing that companies are social enterprises. They play a very complex role in society overall. They are private sector companies are major employers in most countries around the world. They're major movers of capital, and therefore they have a huge influence. But they're all coming to recognize that their futures are very uncertain. And do they want to rely on governments to direct that future, or are they going to have to increasingly take matters into their own hands? You think about the transition with technology and what that means for employment. I think that is beginning to get a lot of companies really beginning to challenge their business model about will they exist, going from a producer to a service company. It's going to be very challenging. Millennials and the younger generations want maybe different ways of working. Maybe they accept maybe more remote working. Maybe they're more entrepreneurial than we think. Yeah. So I do think that there is a power in the social construct of companies, and to recognize that. And sometimes there's a problem of demonizing companies as in the old capitalist way of looking at it. But if we are going to produce solutions, they are going to be part of the solution.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to close, but I'm going to close with a few thoughts, because actually I don't want to stop on a thought around demons. The first is that we're going to move now into some more specific sessions that are going to really have deep dives, one around climate risk, which is in this room, and then the other, which is more around fintech, which is in the puddle room. And I'm not going to let you go there until you listen to a few thoughts. Sorry. The first is, you can't demonize anyone. I used to work in the oil and gas sector, and I found just as many friends across the globe working in the oil and gas sector simply because these were smart engineers that needed a job. And this comes back to the wealth distribution aspect. There are no absolutes anywhere. We basically have to figure out how we can bring everyone on board. The conservatives versus the left, we've got radicalization on both sides. We've seen it in terms of the elections. And there has been a continued thought process. So I ask you all to join the conversation, and I appreciate the fact that Cameron brought it on, because many of us who are working in this game realize that we missed the boat. We realize that we created too many demons. We realized that we were doomsday. Now, as the president of the Club of Rome that started the whole doomsday scenarios, I'm trying to build on that history, but make people understand that actually, yes, we needed to know what the problem was, but now we need to sure in the hell get on with the solutions. Otherwise, we won't have anyone on board. So it's a call to all of you. First of all, unusual bedfellows. The faith groups. We rarely talk about the faith groups. The fact is, most of the conservatives and others go to church. Get the faith groups to speak and preach to the environmental cause. And we've seen that very much through the Laudato and the Pope already. The military, we're going to get into climate risk. Military is inextricably linked to national security and the security element. So we already have a lot of people that in the past, some of us might have thought they were demons. They're not. And they're actually working on this. So as you move into your more specific thinking around some of the problem areas in the breakout sessions, I just want to hold that thought and leave with people are people, no matter what role they have. And if you can get to their heart and into the sense of belonging, then we can bring this on the journey. And even through Climate-KIC and the Advisory Council, we had a very clear conversation around how do you work with Hungary? How do you work with Italy? We've already had calls from Italy, actually, to work with them on environmental issues. Totally radical, new thinking coming out. So no one necessarily is not ready to come on board. You just have to do a pretty damn good pitch as to why they're part of this story. And that's what I'm going to leave with you. Thank you.